How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Today's guest on the Culture Architects show comes to us from a pretty unique position. For a little bit of context here, over the last few years, I've been actively exploring the question of what comes next for high-performing culture, the organization that I had founded for delivering the culture by design methodology. And during my exploration and my search, it led me to Dustin Campbell, who's today's guest. And Dustin is a co-founder of Persistence Management Holdings and the consulting firm Persistently. And over the past year, Dustin and I have had a lot of conversations about culture. We talk about this all the time, all of which culminated in Persistence's acquisition of my company this past spring. Now, even before our paths crossed, though, Dustin has long been a champion of taking kind of I would call it a human-centered approach in building high-performing organizations. He has over 20 years of experience turning companies around, with perhaps his most remarkable story to date in the form of AdTech Systems, a company that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Anyway, today's conversation is not so much a passing of the torch, but more of an illumination of who Dustin is as a culture architect and what's next for the CultureWise operating system with him at the wheel. So with that, Dustin, welcome finally to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thanks for having me, David. Excited to be here.
You bet. So for our audience's sake, I want to give a little bit of background for our listeners so they understand sort of where you're coming from. So how did you get into leadership? Was that something as you were growing up, you're always really drawn to leadership, or where did that interest come from?
Yeah. I think it became a little bit later for me. When I was younger, I think I just spent a lot of time wanting to fit in. I don't think I was ever the one that was saying I have to lead the charge and be the one at the helm all the time. I was never a great athlete, which is where a lot of leadership was formed, at least where I grew up. And I think for a lot of people growing up, I did ultimately, fall in love with playing basketball. I grew up in Southern Indiana, and you kind of had to. And I really learned a lot from, my time playing basketball. I was never great. I was never the captain of the team or anything like that. But it did teach me a lot about teamwork. It was a little bit later, probably in my career, where I got involved in some nonprofit organizations, and I really saw some of the impact that the leaders in those organizations were having. And I was really blown away by, what if you wanted to make some positive change in the world, most of it happens through organizations, and people that know how to lead those organizations can really have an exceptional impact. Yeah.
And so you eventually, I know, got into the private equity world.
Yeah.
And how did that happen?
Yeah. So I spent the first part of my career, I started my career at a small investment banking firm, spent about 3 years there. And then I moved to a large pharmaceutical firm. I didn't have a lot of the language for it back then, but the difference between those two cultures just could not have been more stark. And I was absorbing a lot of that. It was when I was working at the pharmaceutical company, I got really involved in a number of community organizations, was really inspired by a lot of what I saw, realized, I was also sort of, I kind of grew up a kid not paying attention to much else beyond what was, right in front of me in the world. But I had started to, pay a little more attention, was developing a little bit of civic responsibility, started paying a little bit of attention to politics, and really became fascinated with what good leaders are able to do and to accomplish. And through some of that work, I decided, I think I want to learn how to run an organization someday. And so I ended up applying to business schools. I had briefly considered, maybe going to get a PhD in one thing or another. But I was really moved by some of the people that I met along that journey and seeing some of the changes that they were able to make in their community and people's lives. So I went back to business school. I came out of there thinking, I really am mission driven. I had a little experience in education organizations and healthcare. Really thought I might spend, my career in one of those areas. I also had a girlfriend at the time and had to try to figure out like where I was going to live that worked for her as well. So I got a job at a consulting firm, spent a year there, and realized, one thing was really stark for me. I had one case where I was super intellectually stimulating in the healthcare industry, and I was miserable. The team just wasn't organized the right way. The second case couldn't be more intellectually boring. It was an integration of back office accounting firms for
that sounds exciting.
Yeah. And I was blown away by how much I enjoyed that case. The team just was amazing. And it was a real inflection point for me where I realized, almost to the exclusion of everything else, the thing that really gets me up every day and motivates me is just like knowing that I'm going into something with people that I really like being with. And coincidentally, at that time, one of my best friends and now partners, Eric Waters, who you know well, took a job at a large private equity firm, and they were relatively early. This was around 2007, 2008. They were relatively early in investing pretty heavily in building out an operations function to work with the portfolio companies, and they were growing pretty rapidly, at least up until the financial crisis hit. And he recruited me to come and join him there, and so that's how I sort of got into that experience.
So when you were in private equity, working from an operations kind of role, you got a chance to see a lot of different kinds of companies. And
yes.
I'm assuming got a chance to see things that work and things that don't work.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, that kind of helped to maybe shape or form your point of view about the world, or about leadership, maybe more specifically. So talk to me a little bit about what is it that you observed, either that you said, I don't want to ever do that, or things you observed that you said, you know what, if I'm ever running a company, it's going to look more like this.
Yeah.
Tell me about those experiences. How did that form or influence how you think about things today?
Yeah. I think, when you're younger, you don't have all the frameworks and a lot of the language and the experience to compare things. And so I was definitely in a transition point where I was was gathering a lot of experience quickly. The role that I was in was we were responsible for, 5 to 6 portfolio companies. We did some financial analysis, but went out and did like a lot of special project work, working directly with the executive teams. We got to sit in on all the board meetings, got to see how the investors like approached it, got to do some due diligence on some investment acquisitions. So really got exposed to a wide range of things, and saw, you start pattern matching. You start seeing somebody over here is doing this thing and somebody over here is doing it. And you get a feel sometimes for like, oh, I don't know, that just doesn't sit quite right. But, you sit and you're like, well, maybe I don't understand it. I'm still learning. And over time, some of those pieces start to fall into place. And what did it for me was, after a few years on that operating team, I was recruited by a guy that was getting put in as the new CEO of one of the portfolio companies. He was the second CEO going in. The first team didn't perform the way the investment firm had hoped. And he was different. He was really different from a lot of the CEOs that I had seen. And this was a pretty unique situation. The company, when I say it didn't perform, the first team didn't perform as well as they had hoped. That's an understatement. The company was in rough shape, and he was a serial turnaround guy. And the other thing that I guess maybe was the most helpful was he loved to teach. And I'm pretty curious by nature. I tend to ask a lot of questions, and he just helped me like really sort the puzzle pieces, I guess. And so I reflected back on some of the other things that I'd seen, and watched the way that he did things. And I would constantly ask him questions like, hey, I saw you do this. Why did you do that? And he's like, great question. Or I'd take a stab at why I thought he did it. And he's like, well, I could see why you might think that, but this is actually what we were trying to accomplish. And I got to work with him for about 4 years. And it was really after about 2 years of working with him that the puzzle pieces like really coalesce. And I saw the system that he was implementing. And as I think you and I have discussed, most of that system lived in his head, as I've learned for most CEOs, it does. And so that really helped, bring together for me, like, oh, we can put together a structure and that is more teachable and bring more people along on that, which is sort of what got us started on this journey that we're here now on.
Yeah. So somewhere in there, maybe it was with this guy that you were working with that taught you so much, this mentor. In addition to seeing business as a series of systems that you could create and document and therefore teach, somewhere along the line, you had this recognition, I'm assuming, but tell me otherwise is okay. You had this recognition that culture, or the way in which people relate to each other, is a real differentiator in business, or maybe not. I'll say it. You could call it a differentiator, or another way you could look at it is it's a driver of performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how did that come to you? And that probably pretty unusual in the private equity world.
Yeah. That definitely started earlier, but again, it was some like more of a feeling and some of the language and retrospect that I learned and frameworks I could look back on and see more clearly where I was. And so, I would say, early on in my career, so the first job that I worked at, small investment banking firm, this is the late 90s, there was a bunch of guys in a regional office or regional headquarters. It was the headquarters not New York City, which in the investment banking world, there's New York investment banks, and then there's these other guys. And they had brought this culture from New York to this smaller, city. And I learned a lot. I actually really liked a lot of the people individually, and I was miserable. I was really miserable in the environment. I found myself being pulled into participating in things that just I was like, well, I don't want to be doing this. And again, I don't want to disparage that firm doesn't actually exist anymore, but I don't want to disparage any of the people there or anything. Cause like I said, I like most of them. There were a couple of leaders that I think we're just really misguided. And it was interesting. My first, your first job out of college, you don't know what the world is like. You're just like, I don't know. Is this how we do things? But to say that it was, a sexist environment would be an understatement. To say it was, an old boys club would be an understatement. There was just a lot of things about it that never really sat well with me. Nevertheless, I learned a lot. I got a lot of opportunities to engage in a lot of different things and participate in ways that were pretty great for a young person. But moving from there to, in this firm, I will say, I went to work at Eli Lilly after that. And Eli Lilly was just a really remarkable place. It was filled with just incredibly smart people who took their jobs seriously. The things that they were working on, they believed in passionately. And they just had an environment where people were good to each other. And it wasn't by any sacrifice of performance. It wasn't, a managing director yelling at somebody because, their spreadsheet was formatted to 1 decimal point instead of 2 or something like that. And I just saw they just got a lot out of people. They respected people. There was a lot of things that was just man, this just fits a little bit better. And so, I didn't really have a lot of the language now that I have to be able to describe what was going on there, but man, did it feel different. And so, that was sort of an early place that I understood it. When I went to work for that mentor, the thing that was pretty unique was, the PE firm had owned this company for, I think, 4 years before they put him in. And it was in a small town in a southern state. It was one of the biggest private employers in the area, but it was, there wasn't, it was 90 miles outside of Atlanta. There wasn't an ability to recruit a bunch of people in. Plus, the future of the firm was in doubt for a while. And he just set about, other than him, and, I was fortunate able to tag along, other than really him. And I think there was one other person, sort of in a role similar to mine that came along, but the rest of the executive team and the middle management layer within the company didn't change. It was the same team. And he went in and he built structure and process and whatnot. And that was important. But you could just see the way people started to play differently. He had a way to teach people this is the way we do it together. And that was where it started to really become clear to me, oh, it's not just getting processes in place. I am pretty process oriented. I definitely went through a phase early in my career where I thought, well, if I can just build the best process, then we got it. And became kind of obsessed with that. So I do like processes, but processes need to evolve. And if you want them to evolve in a healthy and positive and continually improving way, you got to get the people involved in doing that and get them working together so they understand the objective and what they're going after. And watching the way he did this was just really, really remarkable. And he moved quickly and he brought people with him. And it was just a really fun experience.
So, yeah, to you and me, this seems somewhat obvious that if you could get the people to work together well, to enjoy where they are, to be engaged in what they're doing, they're going to perform, at a higher level. This is a pretty obvious thing. And yet, in your experience with private equity, and certainly I don't have the experience you do there, but from what I see and hear so often from private equity firms, it seems that not that many of them have as deep an appreciation for the importance of the role that the culture, the people part of the business plays in ultimately delivering the results they're after. I mean, we know they're there principally to get a return on investment. And yet we know that if the people part is done right, they're going to get a bigger return on investment. And yet, as obvious as that sounds, it seems like so few, not none, but so few private equity firms fully appreciate or are willing to invest in the people part of growing the business. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I've put a lot of thought into this, as you and I have discussed. I'll try to take a little bit of the less cynical version. There's a cynical version of it that, I think is, I can fall into sometimes and maybe be a little cavalier in the way I explain it. But I think the less cynical version of that is a couple of things. One, we really have to consider the context. You always have to consider the context in which you're operating in. For the last 20 years, roughly, give or take, the private equity world has just seen this explosion in funds available, and the amount of money that's poured into it has been tremendous. Part of this is related to a macroeconomic environment where there was nearly 0% interest rates, which is to these guys free money, to go throw around at assets. And where I think most people can relate to that is over the last 20 years, you didn't have to work really hard to generate wealth in the value of your home. If you were fortunate enough to buy a house 20 years ago at, whatever it was, 3% interest rates, today it's probably in most markets at least double the value. And you can look at that and say man, I was a genius. I invested at the right time. I did it. And so private equity, where it's more levered and they are smart, very, very smart in financial engineering, took advantage of that environment. And what happened to real estate prices happened in an extraordinary way in corporate valuations. And so people made a lot of money just buying, holding an asset, cobbling a few more together. And, to just double click on that a little bit more, they did aggregate firms together and get what, we call multiple arbitrage, where a bigger firm is worth something more than a littler firm. So if you buy a bunch of littler firms, your bigger firm, the valuation, grows. So that's one of the contexts in which, PE firms were operating, and they didn't have to get the operations great, and the other thing that I think is really important that I've reflected on a lot is the business model and the working model, the professional model of private equity firms, because it's very similar to investment banking firms and law firms. These are expertise-driven organizations, and they are not run like most operating firms. They are almost like a bunch of individual proprietors sharing a back office and some shared services and support structures. But many of them are what we call an eat what you kill model. They get compensated more for deals that they find and deals that they nurture and execute on. And this is just very different from the way most organizations run. Those two things, that expertise driven and that organizational structure and how they think about the world, has a real impact on the way that they view the investments that they make. And what I mean by that, and where it shows up that I think is, almost everybody I know who works in private equity kind of jokes about this, is they're always looking at everything through the numbers. And if the numbers aren't right, the person in charge of the numbers from their perspective must be doing something wrong. And the person that they interact with the most is probably the CEO, but oftentimes it's the CFO, and the CFO is the numbers guy. And so it's the running joke is sort of like how many CFOs a private equity firm goes through within, for each company that they own during the time that they own it. And the reason why is they speak the same language, and the PE guys are almost always more advanced. They are really brilliant when it comes to finance. That's the language they speak, and it's the lens through which they see everything. The challenge is that you don't win the race by staring at the speedometer, and the numbers are an output from all of the work that goes into making a business work. And there's a lot of fundamental things that we have to do in the business that will generate better outcomes.
Right.
But if you just stare at the speedometer or at the scoreboard and just torture people about why the numbers aren't what you want them to be, you spend a lot of effort and energy focused on the wrong things, actually distracting the team away from the fundamentals. In private equity firms, it's really interesting. I have a few friends who were investment professionals who then took operating roles for a couple of years in a portfolio company and almost always run back out really quickly. And I don't mean to take anything away from them, but the thing that I hear is it's really hard. You have to deal with so many people issues. It's like, that's the thing. That's what running a business is. It's dealing with people issues. You got to understand how the business works. You got to understand the functional things and how they work together, but it's just getting people to work together. And in the PE world, it's just a very different operating model.
Yeah. It's interesting as I think about what you're saying and I reflect upon my experience, which is different from yours. You always sometimes refer to my experiences as first principles, but I think about, I used to say this years ago, I still think it's true. I never worked in any company other than my own. So I've had two companies, sort of three, in my life, and they've all been mine. Yeah. And so coming out of school as a philosophy major, which I was, and going to work, for myself and building my first company, I never worked anywhere else. I didn't know how you're supposed to do it. Yeah. And I used to say that in some cases was an advantage of mine because I didn't know how you're supposed to do it. I just did what made sense to me. And it just seemed obvious to me that if you treat people in a certain way and you teach them the way you want to do things, it'd be a lot better. So why wouldn't you do that? Yeah. And so all of the things that I built over my career came just from me not being saddled with preconceived notions about how it's usually done. Yeah. And just doing what makes sense to me. That seems to work pretty well. Why would we do it any other way?
Start with getting humans to work well together.
Yeah. Geez, that's pretty obvious. And that wraps up the first half of my conversation with Dustin Campbell, co-founder of Persistence Management Holdings and Persistently. When we continue next time, Dustin shares the story of leaving the private equity world behind, what he and his partner set out to prove, and how those early lessons paved the way to our eventual collaboration. We're also going to dive into what it really takes to turn a company around while keeping culture at the center. All that and more in part 2 of my conversation with Dustin Campbell.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.